listening, for sharing your thoughts and questions. Of course, well, this is Understanding the Holocaust. My name is Randy Freed. Thanks to Wilshire Boulevard Temple at Home and to Rabbi Nanis, who's doing incredible work in providing every day adult programming for the WBT community and beyond. It's amazing. And so thank you to them. Today, we're going to be talking about the legacy of the Holocaust and what does that mean and where do we go from here? And I think that I was thinking a lot about where do we start in talking about legacy. And I think that hopefully through the course of the last, well, it's been 7 weeks because we skipped a week, in thinking about part of the legacy, I think is that there are many narratives to the Holocaust. There are many stories you could tell. There are many angles you can tell. And yes, knowing statistics and knowing dates is good information, but the way that we really connect to the Holocaust, I think, is write the story of one by one. So, for example, today is the anniversary of the Ulma family, which was a righteous among the nation. It was a Polish family that for hiding Jews, and I had mentioned them in a previous class about resistance. They had 6 children. The wife was pregnant, 9 months pregnant, and they were all murdered for hiding Jews. And so telling a story and making it personal, in fact, or if we look at Schindler's List, that watershed moment in 1994, Steven Spielberg, that's when he won his first Academy Award, actually won 7 Academy Awards for Schindler's List, the birth of the USC Shoah Foundation, and a moment when it was really okay to come out and talk in a major way about the Holocaust, to hear witness testimony, and to record more and more testimony. And now the Shoah Foundation is recording witnesses to other genocide. And so today we're going to I'll share my screen. We're hopefully going to spend a little time in seeing where is the legacy going and how do we remember. So for those of you who know Hebrew, oftentimes there's an interesting little idea. There is no great word for history in Hebrew. The word in Hebrew for history is historia, but as it sounds, that is the adaptation of the Latin history. A word, though, that we do have in Hebrew, zachor, is memory. And oftentimes there's a joke about, well, why history? Well, history is not necessarily personal because history is his story, someone else's story. We don't place ourselves in it. But memory is me. And similar to what we're all about to do Saturday night and Sunday night when we join our families virtually or perhaps together for Pesach, is we insert ourselves in the story. It's a funny way to think about it, but in some ways, the act, the commitment, the obligation, the burden of memory for the Jewish people of the Shoah is actually well suited for us because our tradition is constantly talking about memory. So first, how do we get to Yom HaShoah in the first place? Or International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So as is formally known, which is coming up, Yom HaZikaron L'Shoah L'Gvura, Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day, known in Israel and abroad as Yom HaShoah, and English Holocaust Remembrance Day. Israel, it is a public holiday and a national holiday of mourning, and it was inaugurated in 1953 by Ben Gurion and Yitzhak Ben Tzvi. A couple interesting ideas. Why the 27th day of Nisan? It's after Pesach. And if it falls on a Friday or Saturday, they move it to Sunday. So, of course, all things in Israel can never be that easy. If you doubt that, just look at the results of the 4th election. Seems that Israel, in many ways, politically is in deadlock. So, similarly, in 1948 to 1950, the Knesset was going back and forth, and there were 2 factions really deciding about how can we have What do we do with the Holocaust Remembrance Day? And in 1948 and 1950 in the Knesset, you had many survivors of the Shoah, as well as you had even fighters from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the Knesset. And they were saying, we want to have Holocaust Remembrance Day, and why it's called Gvura, which is a hero, that we will mark the day of memory on the day when we as Jews fought back, on the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was April 19th. But that was much earlier. That was actually on the 14th of Nisan. It's much earlier. It was on Erev Pesach. And the religious in Israel were saying, no, you can't do that. The month of Nisan, from a halachic point of view, from a Jewish legal point of view, is supposed to be a day and a period of great joy. How could we possibly observe a national day of mourning when we're coming into a holiday of redemption? It was a big debate. And of course, there's rumors that there was, like anything in politics, there was horse trading in order to get the day that they wanted. Then they said, okay, well, maybe we could do it, but we could only go to the 19th of Nisan, because that's when Commander Stroop, who was a Nazi, declared Warsaw free of all Jews. Maybe we could have it up to that point, because the fact is we survived, and the world and Warsaw was not free of Jews. A lot of wrangling, but that would have been in the middle of Passover. And so then eventually the decision was, we will place the holiday 1 week before Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. It's, it reminds me, when I was thinking about this, actually, Rabbi Leader in his book, not his most recent one, the one before, right, that something more beautiful than before. The idea that, and it's never worth the pain and the anguish and what you go through, but hopefully something more beautiful than before is revealed. So the leadership of Israel ultimately settled on a week before Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, and Yom HaZikaron, which are within 24 hours, Israeli Memorial Day, that the answer to the Holocaust was the state of Israel. And not that Israel happened because of the Holocaust, not because there was a direct link in some ways, but the answer to overwhelming death of Jews was an overwhelming outpouring of life. The state of Israel was born. And for any of you who have been to Israel, there are cafes, there is art, there is an abundance of life and innovation and creativity. And that this would be the way that the Jewish people would recognize and memorialize the Holocaust. They would put it into the context that this pain and this, what was brought upon us as Jews, is never worth it. We all want our family back. But ultimately, something more beautiful than before was revealed to us as we created the state of Israel. Now, the International Holocaust Remembrance, now actually a couple details just so you know, because it sounds lovely that Israel finally created a holiday. In 1953, when the holiday is officially declared as a Remembrance Day, it gets ignored largely by the Israeli populace. Still a work day, not an official day of mourning initially. And it isn't until 1959, 6 years later, that it is finally formally declared as a formal day of mourning through the entire country. International Holocaust Remembrance Day is actually much, much newer. 2005, United Nations declares at the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau by the Soviet Army, January 27, 1945. This is when we will commemorate internationally the Holocaust. So the question is, well, then why two difference? Why did the Jewish people not choose the day that Auschwitz was liberated? And the answer is because that was not of our own making. And it didn't really fit the political narrative of Israel, that we went and we fought for our land and we were willing as Jews to stand up. International Holocaust Day, by contrast, it celebrates the day when somebody else liberated us. And the United Nations Resolution 60-70 /7 really talks that this day should be spent on recommitting ourselves, that we being the world, to stand up against genocide. Now, the sad reality is that we know, in fact, genocide still happens. Maybe not on the same scale, but it still happens. So this is how we first begin to think about memory. But I want you to think as well, and I wanted to share with you, what does it look like? How do we remember? How do we pause? Well, take a few minutes. This is what happens. This is what you're looking at, about to watch a video of. This is the main highway running through Tel Aviv. I believe it's the 2. And you'll see. So it's a holiday, but like any other holiday, people are driving on their way to wherever. You could also see some of this driving, typical of Israelis, driving a little bit crazy. But something miraculous begins to happen. You'll start to notice, little by little, people pulling over. So similar to Yom HaZikaron, which is Israel's Memorial Day, the entire country will come to a stop. So on Erev Rosh Hashanah, on Erev Yom HaShoah, the evening before, at sundown, the air raid siren would blast across the entire country of Israel, noting the formal beginning of Yom HaShoah. And then on the day of, a 2-minute siren sounds across the whole country, which marks the beginning of the official memorial ceremony at Yad Vashem on Mount Herzl. For 2 minutes, nearly 6 million people come to a stop. How do we memorialize? How do we commemorate? When we stop to dwell in a thought for 2 whole minutes, we realize how much time there is. And with that, a national day of mourning continues. The people, just as they stopped, go about their day. But I wonder too, in thinking about what is the legacy and how do we remember and how do we try to create a story and a narrative that's personal? The truth is, there's a lot of ways. We do it through music. We do it through story. We do it from testimony of survivors. And I wanted to share with you now, this is just because I think she's rather unique. This is, you're about to watch a video by a Polish artist. This is takes place a few years ago in Łódź, or Łódź, if you're in Poland. And she decides to perform. These are all Catholics, and they decide to commemorate a poem that's written by Władysław Slengel, who is known as the Warsaw Ghetto poet. And I'd like to share with you a little bit about the poem at the end, but just give it a listen. This is just from a couple years ago. I excuse my daughter crying in the background, if you hear her, but then again, apropos. The poem by Władysław Slengel, who writes this poem in 1942, the story sets out, it's sung in Polish, but she's saying the story of a mother sitting with her, with hair white as snow, and her small child holding a lilac, turns to her mother and says, "What does the word afar mean?" And the poem goes on to say of a mother struggling, how can I explain afar to my child? To travel to the mountains, to travel to the sea, these things are afar. When my child will never see the mountains or the sea. How could I explain distant lands, different loves, different life experiences that are afar when my child will never see them? So through music and through art, we remember, we connect to personal feelings, and we connect to, I apologize for the banging. It sounds like my son is trying to Zoom bomb our class. Forgive me. 1 second. Charles, I was teaching a class. Mommy's in the shower. I was teaching a class. No, yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. So the other way that we talk about memory really is in pictures. So the picture you're looking at is a picture of students from the March of the Living several years ago. And so when I give tours at Birkenau, in the northern part of the camp, there's a building called the Sauna. Now, this was a building where they did delousing of clothes, and it was an area of the camp that they called Canada, because that's where the Nazis perceived Canada as a land of plenty, and this was what they called an area where they stored all of the stolen products from, belongings, I should say, of inmates at Auschwitz. And in the sauna and in this room, there is this one exhibit. And as you see, it's a picture of a bunch of teenagers looking at pictures. There is a French author, Henri Guy de Maupassant, who says beautifully, "Our memory is a more perfect world than the universe. It gives back life to those who no longer exist." And what I would put to you as well about when we think about the Holocaust and the legacy and the narrative that we can say, what are the stories that you would tell? Just look at your own cell phone. If you, like me, have thousands of pictures in your phone, what were the last pictures you took? If you were to tell a story about yourself, or you had to delete every picture you own, but maybe 10, what 10 would they be? What would the story be that you could tell from those photos? And this, in some ways, becomes the legacy of the Holocaust. And I would submit to you, the legacy is how we translate the story and make that individual connection. Steven Spielberg talked at the 25th anniversary of Schindler's List, which was 2 years ago. Well, I guess a little more than 2 years ago. He interviewed extensively, and he talked about that it was a turning point for him because he realized the power of the Holocaust is in making it a personal subject that we could connect to. We all remember the girl in a red coat, filmed against a black and white backdrop. And so photos become a key part of the Holocaust. So many family photos, not necessarily the death and dying, because those were taken by Nazis, but how people lived. We memorialize and commemorate as well at the actual places where the Holocaust happened. And so since we obviously are not traveling to Poland at the moment, I wanted to share with you drone footage of Auschwitz I and Birkenau. Every one of those chimneys you see is one barrack. One barrack would hold nearly 1,000 people. That is the execution block. The building on your right is where Cyclone B is used for the first time. So I wanted to share with you, in January of 2020, I had the honor of traveling to Poland on behalf of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps of the World Jewish Congress, where literally hundreds of people from around the world, diplomats, monarchs, most importantly, survivors, came to mark the 75th anniversary since the liberation of Auschwitz. And on that evening, there were three speakers, but one of whom in particular, Marian Turski, who is a noted Polish historian, still lives in Poland, talked about indifference. And in terms of legacy, I thought it was worth us all listening to. Also worth noting, he is 94 years old. He's about to be 95. And for those of you who good at math, that means he was born in 1926. And it means that at the outbreak of the war in 1939, he was 13 years old. So his early teenage years through the war, from 13 to 19, he was a prisoner of Auschwitz. Practically, he was there in Auschwitz for 2.5 years. But here are his words.
My dear comrades of the horrors in the camp, distinguished guests, distinguished visitors to this place, friends, I am but one of those who are still alive. Few who were here in this place almost until the last moment before the liberation. On the 18th of January, my so-called evacuation started. Evacuation from this camp, from Auschwitz, and after 6.5 days, it ended. It turned out to be the death march for more than every other co-inmates, my fellow inmates. We walked together as a column of 600 people. According to all probability, I will not live to see another jubilee here. This is how it goes. So please forgive me that there will be some emotions in what I'm going to say. Now, this is what I would like to say, to tell primarily to my daughter, to my granddaughter who is here in this room, and I would like to thank her for that, to my grandson as well. But I'm mostly after those who are the peers of my daughter and my grandchildren, the younger generations, especially the youngest, those who are even younger than they are. When the World War broke out, I was but a teenager. In the First World War, my father was a soldier, and he was shot into his lungs, and that kept repeating. That was a drama for our family, and it went on and on. My mother hailed from the Polish, Lithuanian, Belarusian borderland. Armies went forth and back. They pillaged, raped, burned villages, not to leave anything for those who were coming after them. So you could say that I had first-hand experience of war. Nonetheless, even though it was only 20, 25 years apart, those times seemed so distant, like those Polish 19th century uprisings, like the French Revolution, and that was only 20 years away. So when today I meet young people, I perfectly well realize that after 75, if not 80 years, people get somewhat bored. They find war, Shoah, Holocaust somewhat of a boring subject, just like genocide. And I actually understand them. That is why I promise to you, the young, that I'm not telling you about my suffering. I'm not telling you about what I experienced, my 2 death marches, how I finished the war weighing 32 kilo, really on the verge of life, utterly exhausted. I'm not telling the things that were worst, the worst, the tragedy of the farewells, of parting with the near and dear, when after the selection you see and you sense their fate. No, I'm not telling you about that. What I would like to pass to my daughter, to my grandchildren, and to their generations, I would like to tell you something about you yourselves. I see we have among us the President of Austria, Mr. Alexander van der Bellen. Do you remember, Mr. President, when you hosted me and the management of the International Auschwitz Committee? We discussed those days. You used such a phrase, Auschwitz ist nicht vom Himmel gefallen. Auschwitz did not fall down from the skies. You could say, that's an obvious thing. absolutely obvious. It did not. This may even seem a hackneyed phrase, quite commonplace perhaps, yet this is a profound shortcut in our thinking, and it helps to understand certain things. Let's use our imagination and our thoughts to get to the early 1930s, to Berlin. We find ourselves in the center of Berlin. Parische Viertel, the Bavarian district, is the name of that district. It's just 3 stops away from the Tiergarten, the zoo. There is a station of the metro there. There is Barishev Park. And one day, in those early 1930s, you can read an inscription on the benches. Jews must not sit on these benches. You could say, it's unpleasant, it's not fair, it's not right. But after all, there are so many benches around. You can sit somewhere else. Of course you can. In that district, and that was a district that was inhabited by intellectuals, by the intelligentsia, German, of Jewish origin. Albert Einstein used to live there. Nelly Sachs, the Nobel Prize winner, a politician and industrialist, Walter Rathenau, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs. There was a swimming pool, and over its door an inscription read, Jews are forbidden to enter. You could say, well, pleasant this is not, but there are so many places in Berlin where you can take a bath or swim, so many lakes, canals, it's nearly like Venice. At the same time, you can read somewhere else, Jews must not belong to German singing associations. So what? All right, they want to sing, they want to make music. Let them just meet somewhere else, they will do their singing. All right. What comes up later is an order, really, more of an order than of an inscription. Non-Aryan children must not play with Aryan children, with the German children. All right, they'll play on their own. And then you read, we only sell bread and food to Jews after 5 p.m. Right? Less choice. This makes your life harder. But after all, after 5 p.m., you can still do your shopping. Now, I warn you, I'm getting used to a thought. That thought that someone may be excluded becomes mediated into our lives. The thought that somebody can be stigmatized, that someone may be alienated. And that's how it is done, step by step, slowly. People begin to see that this is something normal. Both victims and the perpetrators, the witnesses, those whom we in English call bystanders, those who see it become familiar, and they become acquainted with that thought, familiar with the idea that the minority that produced Einstein, Nelly Sachs, Henry Heine, Mendelssohn's, and many novelists, that it is different, that it can be pushed beyond the margin of the society, that they are different people, that they are alien people, that they are the people that carry germs, that cause pandemics. And this now is a horror. That's dangerous. This is where what may happen soon takes its origin. And let me tell you, if you consider that, and if we remember the words of Mr. President, power that at that time ran sly policy. For example, they met all the claims of workers. The 1st of May was never celebrated. All right, they gave you a day that was free from work. They introduced Kraftig heute, so a special holiday for workers. They could also fight unemployment. They knew how to play on the dignity of a nation. Germans move up from the shame of the Treaty of Versailles. Have your pride back. And that the government also saw that people were slowly engulfed by this lack of sensitivity. They ceased to react to evil. And that was the moment when that government could speed up the process of evil. What came later was something that developed immediately. Jews could not get jobs, they could not emigrate, and then quickly Jews would be sent to ghettos, to Kaunas, to Riga, to my ghetto, the Litzmannstadt, that's the Łódź ghetto. Most people from there were later sent to Kulhof, Chełmno on the Ner, where they were murdered in lorries with exhaust gases. And the rest will make their way to Auschwitz, where in a very modern way and manner, they were murdered with Zyklon B in all those modern gas chambers. And here you see how the words of the president come true. Auschwitz did not fall suddenly from the skies. It was pittering, pattering in all those tiny steps. It was approaching until what happened here behind me did happen. My daughter, my granddaughter, peers of my daughter, peers of my granddaughter, you do not have to know the name of Primo Levi. Primo Levi was one of the most famous inmates of this camp. Primo Levi once used that phrase, "This happened," which means that it may happen again, which means that it may happen anywhere in this world. May I share one personal memory with you? In 1965, I went for a scholarship to the US, to America. And that was the peak, the acme of that battle for human rights, for civil rights, for the Afro-Americans. It was my honor to participate in a march with Martin Luther King from Selma to Montgomery. And then people who learned that I had been an inmate of Auschwitz would ask me, how do you think? It must have been only in Germany, or do you think it could happen somewhere else? And then I told them, it can also happen in your country, in this land, when the civil rights are broken, when people do not obey the laws of minorities, when you do.
Wtedy się może zdarzyć. Co zrobić? Jedyne wyjście to wy sami, mówili mi.
There's only one way out, only you. If you are capable of defending your constitution, defending your laws and your rights, your democratic order, which is based on the protection of minority rights, only then will you be able to conquer all that evil. My dear, here in Europe, most of us hail from the tradition called Judeo-Christian. Both the believers but also the non-believers assume as their civilizational canon the Ten Commandments. My friend, my closest friend, the president of the International Auschwitz Committee, Roman Kent, who spoke here 5 years ago during the previous Jubilee. He couldn't arrive today, he couldn't fly in today. He's frail, he's been sick lately. But he invented the 11th commandment. The 11th commandment that is an experience of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, which is the experience of that horrible time of disdain. And that 11th is be not indifferent. Thou shalt not be indifferent. And this is what I would like to tell you. My daughter, my grandchildren, I'd like to tell it to the peers of my daughter, my grandchildren, wherever they live, be it Poland, be it Israel, be it America, be it Western Europe, the Eastern Europe, yes, precisely, the Eastern Europe. It is very important here. Do not be indifferent when you see lies, historical lies. Do not be indifferent Do not be indifferent when you see that the past is stretched to fit the current political needs. Do not be indifferent when any minority is discriminated, because the essence of democracy is that majority governs, but democracy hinges on the rights of minorities being protected, and they have to be protected. At the same time, do not be indifferent when any power or government infringes all the social compacts that are there, that are already extant, and keep the commandments. 11, thou shalt not be indifferent,
nawet nie obejrzycie
because if you are, you won't even notice when your heirs
Auschwitz nagle spadł.
will suddenly see an Auschwitz falling down, dropping down from the skies straight on them.
So the big lesson being indifference. The legacy I would tell you is of the Holocaust is really in how all of you, me included, act. Are we indifferent? Do we turn a blind eye? And for Passover, it's actually, it fits quite nicely, to be honest with you, because the lesson of Passover is that we were a stranger in a strange land. And the notion that we the notion of do unto others as you would want to do to yourself, or the rest of the phrase that we're strange, treat the stranger because you know what it means to be a stranger in a strange land. The legacy of the Holocaust is the story in which you wish to tell. Is it from the angle of telling a story of a perpetrator? Is it the story of a victim? Is it a story of the righteous among the nations? Finding your story and standing up and giving voice to when you see, just as Marian Tursky mentions, when you start to see government compacts, when you start to see the minority being infringed upon. With that, we have a few minutes. Love to tell you more. The legacy of the Holocaust, I think, listen, as we are in the twilight hours of survivors. I'm remiss if I don't say before, because I want to say this. Wilshire Boulevard Temple, especially, like many Jewish communities, has survivors in its midst. Many of them sometimes go under the radar because you don't even realize or know their story. But today, one of your own, Betty Cohen, happens to be turning 100 years old. Betty Cohen has an incredible story. And so if you don't know it, I encourage you to, through Cheryl, perhaps send her a happy birthday message and find a time, maybe even to hear her story. She is, I'm pretty sure she's in better shape than I am. She is full of gusto. She is full of life. And of course, I wish her a very happy 100th birthday. And with that, I thank you to Wilshire Boulevard Temple. If there's any questions, comments, thoughts, please open your mic and feel free to share.
Yeah. Do a full screen.
Nope, that's it. No questions, thoughts, or comments.
Have you given us an email already?
Have I given you an email? I have not, but I will send one now to everyone. You're always welcome to, let's see, here we go. It's in the chat. It's basically my name. It's Randall Fried. So it's RANDALLFRIED @gmail.com. I'm always on my email. So, and I would love to continue the conversation, or if we were to do a book group or something, whatever it may be, I look forward to continuing the conversation. And again, I want to thank all of you. Most of you have been hanging in there for the last, for all 6 sessions, and I appreciate it. And I hope that this series has answered some questions and also maybe piqued some interest in learning more about a very significant part of our history, both as Jews and as humans. And with that, I wish all of you, if there's no other questions, just wish all of you a happy, a healthy Pesach. Yes, Larry, your hand went up again.
Without losing our temper, how do we respond to a denier of the Holocaust?
Okay, I'll answer that as quickly as possible. The short answer, I think, is, so the first is I think the first thing you have to quickly try to analyze and figure out is whether a denier is actually interested in dialogue, and if their denial is coming out of a place of true ignorance, or if it's because it's almost like they're not interested in hearing what you have to say, and they just want to argue with you. Look, Holocaust education is another legacy. I would say that I would hope that you will all become more of California. Holocaust education is required, but it may surprise you Now, there are currently a number of states that it's working through the state legislature to require Holocaust education. But even if every state passed tomorrow, it may surprise you to know that only 24 states,
Wow.
if all of the legislation passes this year, which I doubt, only 24 out of 50 states would then require Holocaust education. The current states that provide Holocaust education is 12. Actually, no, just 13. Oregon just passed it. So that's something to figure. That's something for us to fight for, because education is also the key.
I want to thank you so much. This was a very personal story for me because my parents were old. And when you talked about not being able to play with other children, I even went through that here when I was about 8, 9 years old. I was kicked in the rear by a neighbor's sister, and told them, they told me I couldn't play at their house anymore. So
yeah, there's a lot of painful history. LA, LA used to be heralded as one of the widest cities in America, and was home to.
You froze. You froze. Is it because of the time? You froze. Where is he?
There he is.
Pesach.
You couldn't hear the last part of it.
Oh, I just was saying, have a wonderful Pesach. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that's why you couldn't find it. Randall Free.